Earlier this week, we got massive changes to many constructed formats, Modern, Legacy, Pauper, and some changes that didn't happen for others. And all of that and more is discussed in today's weekly MTG stream. I kind of popped into it live, just kind of going over some of the details, and at the end of the video, going over my extended thoughts as well. So timestamps down below. Let me know what you think initially, though. We've had some time, especially for you Pauper players out there. You've had time to work with High Tide. For you Modern players out there, what are you thinking about a post-non-combo world and Legacy? Are blue decks finally back? Let me know in the comment section down below. What do you think is happening? Because right now, I'm kind of talking over the stream. I'm not attending the Q&A at all, but I'm excited to see what happens down below. So if I missed anything, I'm going to be watching the Q&A after the fact and getting some ideas there. Let me know if I missed anything in the comment section down below. But overall, let's pop right into the stream in that first little half talking about the big changes in constructed formats.
Today, we are doing our traditional show the day after a banned and restricted announcement. We have a few formats to talk about and
Just
go through. We'll talk about formats where we took action. We'll talk about formats where we didn't take action. And we'll answer a bunch of questions from you in chat as we go along. But to do all of the answering, it's not going to be me. It's going to be these two super intelligent people to my left.
Super people at best.
Okay.
If you don't know who they are, how about you introduce yourselves?
Hey, my name is Gavin Verhey. I'm a principal game designer on Magic the Gathering. And among other things, I also help as part of the Pauper format panel that manages the Pauper format. Me
Shout out
and
to the
some
PFP.
great external folks all work together to help manage that format, which I love a ton. So I'm going to be here to talk about the bannings and unbannings we did in Pauper.
Howdy gamers, I'm Carmen Clemparens. I'm a senior game designer on Magic the Gathering, and I care a lot about Eternal Magic and do a lot of the coordination on the B&R stuff on the inside.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we're gonna step right into it. We're going to, I think, start with I'm gonna call it the most impactful banning, but Gavin may disagree. We're gonna start with Modern. Pauper had a lot of changes, so we're gonna spend a lot of time there. But
Pauper had the biggest changes.
In Modern, we banned Underworld Breach, which people have been asking for. We've seen a lot here. Carmen, why don't you take us through this one?
Yeah, so the thing that actually made us have to take action against Underworld Breach was a Teamer Grinding Station artifact combo deck that would 3 cards at a time use the card Grinding Station to sacrifice an artifact, mill yourself for 3, usually a 0 mana artifact, which you could then cast by escaping it with the 3 cards you just put into your graveyard and slowly churn through your entire library, then use something like Jace, Wielder of Mysteries, Grapeshot, Thassa's Oracle, etc. to actually finish your opponent off from there. It put on extremely impressive win rates at really competitive tournaments. It wasn't really that fun to play against. It was really hard to actually combat. We saw decks putting, 10, 12 sideboard slots?
A lot of sideboard slots, especially when you look at like energy and stuff.
It was clearly a power outlier, and it was a card that in a lot of ways felt like it was on borrowed time for a while, right? This is a card that is already banned in Pioneer and is already banned in Legacy. So whenever you have the format with a larger card pool and a smaller card pool, find it problematic. You kind of had to think the card was on borrowed time.
Yeah.
It was fine before Mox Opal.
In our previous BNR announcement, we unbanned a number of cards, one of which was Mox Opal.
Yes.
Which was pretty key to making the Underworld Breach deck the powerhouse that it is. Did you all discuss Mox Opal in this context?
Yeah, so Mox Opal is a card that we went into sort of eyes open, knowing how strong it would be, knowing that some things could end up going wrong with it. The difference between Mox Opal and Underworld Breach and why we decided to take action against Underworld Breach ultimately was because it felt like there is more fun to be had with Mox Opal long term. There are various Arcbound Ravager decks, or we've seen, honestly, Lantern Control is just for anyone who's
the
played
other
Modern
decks
for a
using
really
Mox
long
Opal
time.
aren't that great.
There are a bunch of different ways to build Mox Opal over time, and it's not clear to us that all of those are inappropriate for Modern. But it is such a versatile and open-ended card that enables a sort of macro archetype that had struggled a bit before Mox Opal got unbanned in artifact shells in general, or committal artifact shells. That we really want to try and give it as much as we can to make sure that we give those decks the chance to actually exist. Whereas if we were to say, banned Mox Opal, in some cases it's not clear to us that the Underworld Breach deck could still hang in that world and be a fun addition to Modern. But if we ban Breach, there is still possible upside to Opal existing.
I will say, as long as they have Opal in the format, they should have a reprint.
A lot of people also really enjoyed those unbans. There were a lot of cool new decks created, a lot of things people were able to explore, memes
Splinter
to be
Twin
had.
not making an impact.
And we talked about future unbannings being a possibility space for Modern. Were any, and you don't have
Big
to
thing
go
they
into
didn't do
specifics,
this time
but
around.
Sure.
Did you all discuss unbannings for this time around?
Yeah, actually. So there are a couple of cards that we did talk about specifically. I won't get into what they are, just because we ended up not moving forward with them, and I don't want speculation to go too hard on this.
Right. The secondary market spikes.
About the unbannings that we did in December in general, and I know some people have kind of labeled this as the way to combat the new additions from Horizon sets.
I think it is.
They are open-ended, and they're ideally something that can go in a bunch of different places where we aren't just prescribing something that we knew was definitely too strong before in a singular archetype and saying, all right, great, fine, take Eye of Ugin, which may be a bad example because that hooks into Horizons cards, but something like that, or Glimpse of Nature, where we know that it probably isn't that fun if it shows up at a really high clip, even in the world that it is strong enough. So either we're going to be unhappy with it being strong, or we might just end up making people feel pretty upset that the card can't even hang anymore, which we've seen.
Okay, but to be fair,
Splinter Twin.
Well, I was just going to bring up Splinter Twin.
So we've obviously seen Mox Opal do some things. We've seen Splinter Twin not do some things. How are you all viewing the success, I guess, of those unbannings from the last round?
I feel like it was successful.
For the most part, I think the team feels pretty good about how it has gone. Obviously, there's the Underworld Breach issue when it comes to Mox Opal. I want to not really say, or I don't want to dodge that, but we've seen Green Sun Zenith show up in Yawgmoth decks. We've seen it show up in Amulet Titan. We've seen Faithless Looting give people a lot to explore. We've seen cards from Aether Drift actually hit in Modern, with Marauding Mako popping up in Hollow One decks.
And it's not that endurance is all over the format to combat that and everything.
From Mono Red all the way up to a Mardu version of the deck. And Charlotte, I think, top 32, top 64, final answer. But that is basically what we wanted those cards to do, was give people stuff to explore, stuff to think about, give you more decks that you could build where you previously might have fallen a little flat in the face of newcomers in the format.
Okay. Well, we can always come back to Modern if people have questions. Again, we'll have a Q&A session at the end. But I do want to move into the legacy bannings. So we had two bannings there, Troll of Khazad-dûm and Sowing Mycospawn. Now, to someone who is a legacy neophyte or doesn't play it much, like myself, in a format of Reanimate, of Brainstorm, Force of Will, Wasteland, these look weird.
Right.
But I think the reasoning that you wrote was pretty intentional here.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things going on here. One is just raw power level, and one is more environmental. Focusing first on Troll of Khazad-dûm. This is a card that has been sort of a pillar of blue-black decks in Legacy for almost 2 years now, since it first came out in Lord of the Rings, Tales of Middle-earth. We saw blue-black decks really just become one of the best things to do in Modern, in part on the back of the quote-unquote grief scam thing that you could do with Reanimate. But Troll of Khazad-dûm, in a lot of ways, is sort of a split card where it does some of the things that a fetch land can do and some of the things that the card Entomb can do, which gives you a very, let's say, free redundancy on ways to put creatures into your graveyard. It's just too low opportunity cost, so you get to actually cheese people out with a lot of damage at a very, very early phase of the game without really
noting that, like, this is uncounterable, quote unquote. Entomb you can stop
from any other, say, all-in combo Reanimate deck. So this was us trying to sort of push the archetype more in that direction, be a bit more committal, be a little bit softer to some of the anti-combo stuff that you would expect to show up in those decks, or at least have to maybe put more discard outlets into their deck to actually get to play the card Reanimate.
Okay.
Right, yeah, point it at themselves.
Reanimate, that's a great segue there, because there are also some questions. Well, why not just hit the card Reanimate if you feel the Reanimator archetype is too strong? So what was the discussion like around that?
So in general, in Legacy, a lot of people who have played Legacy have done it for 10, 20 years and really identify with a specific sort of deck.
A lot of old heads in the format. It's hard
whenever
to...
we can preserve something that is iconic and been a big part of the format for a really long time,
Pillar of the format.
I think generally it is better for us to be extremely positive that we can't get there by nerfing the deck to let people play with the cards that they've wanted to play with for 20 years.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, it feels like that's the promise of an eternal format, is that you can assemble your one deck. You can work really hard trading for all of your Underground Seas, your Reanimates, your, I guess we replaced Gristlebrand recently with Atraxa, but whatever your big finisher is and your Force of Wills, and you can just play Legacy all the time whenever you want, and you can learn the ins and outs of your deck. I think that going after Reanimate is maybe a viable path because there are still some cards like Animate Dead, for example.
I don't know. I don't know about that.
Pull of Khazad-dûm is actually giving the deck a much larger buff on, or excuse me, giving it a lot more strength, just on the different axes that it is able to play. And so narrowing those axes a bit while still preserving what are the cool and epic and awesome parts of the deck felt worth the trade-off.
Yeah. I liked the way you
Touch
put
on
it
this
about
later.
it being sort of a split card fetch land and tomb, both of which are powerful cards. But, you know, Troll of Khazad-dûm, and we'll move on to Sowing Mycospawn in a second, but Troll of Khazad-dûm is one of those cards that, you know, sees play in Timeless as well, which is the format where all kinds of busted stuff happens.
Yeah. Arena's eternal.
I'm not surprised there. But let's talk about Sowing Mycospawn, a 4 mana, you know, sometimes 6 mana to
card
do
does
its
so
thing.
much.
Eldrazi, that's a 3/3. Looks sort of unassuming.
Right.
Yeah,
It's all about what it's tutoring. It's all about what it can
Sowing
tutor.
Mycospawn is one that is more of an environmental issue, where if you look at the metagame of Legacy right now, in general, most mid-range and control decks, other than Eldrazi, have sort of evaporated from the metagame.
Yeah.
And Sowing Mycospawn is one of the big reasons that this has happened, because the Eldrazi deck can do the 6-mana version of this card as early as turn 2. It plays a bunch of 2-mana soul lands. These are Ancient Tombs, City of Traders, stuff like that. It also uses fast mana like Lotus Petal and Grim Monolith in order to crank it out pretty far ahead of schedule. And a lot of the time what it is doing is getting a copy of Wasteland to blow up a land. And Sowing Mycospawn is notably able to target basic lands, which normally in Legacy, that's sort of the free space, where if you commit to playing a bunch of basic islands or basic plains, whatever
doesn't matter, you're
basic you
still
want to play
getting...
with, generally that's going to be your sort of, okay, this is fine, you don't Wasteland this doesn't get hit by Blood Moon, this is going to be okay. In some ways, Sowing Mycospawn is getting got because it violates that heuristic, that expectation.
Also, it's a cast trigger. That's the thing.
It's just on power level, where
it circumvents the counter magic.
Holding your head under and locking you out, prison style, then it's able to actually get some of your late game or your interactive pieces, either an Eye of Ugin for inevitability, or the interaction pieces like Blast Zone, Caracas,
Future
Bog, things that can actually make it so even if you are able to get onto the battlefield, that's still not going to be good enough. So the fact that it is able to be so oppressive so early in the game just makes it really hard to justify playing anything or registering any deck that needs to have 3 lands on the battlefield in order to function. So this has sort of pushed the entire format to a place where it's a bunch of either all-in combo decks, exactly the Reanimator archetype, or Eldrazi, or some other sort of prison-style deck trying to crank out an early Chalice of the Void or Trinisphere that's going to make it so someone doesn't get to play the game. So in general, this has created a spot where even a bunch of Legacy's longtime fans really don't like playing the format very much, even if by the numbers, I think what I wrote in the article is it does a good job of emulating a balanced format.
Right. Sure. Yeah, I want to touch on this later in the video. I did so in yesterday's video.
Now, I've seen some questions along the same lines as Modern. Do you all have any inclination towards unbanning anything in Legacy? Obviously, we didn't this time, but...
Yeah, so in general, I am of the belief that unbans in Legacy are a good thing. I think it is pretty unlikely
Eternal Glory brought this up
where we
the last episode.
Open the gates like we did in Modern, which I don't think it's impossible. The thing that we did in December in Modern was unprecedented, right? So
I think it's a good direction,
I don't want to say
do more of it.
Never, but generally there are only so many times that we can really push that button in Eternal formats. So I generally prefer to unban 1 or 2 things at a time. I think we've seen this over the last couple of years. I know I can say personally I've been a really big champion of unbanning stuff like Mind's Desire, which I think ended up being fun for a while. But in general, you get less content long-term, or you get less versions of Legacy to engage with long-term if you unban a bunch of cards at once, rather than if you unban one thing, that ends up going fine, unban another thing, that ends up going fine, unban another thing, and so on.
It's a scientific
and as
method.
you said, a lot of Legacy players are in it for the long haul.
Yeah, right. And so much of this in general is making sure that we don't end up lighting too many fires at once, because every time you unban something, you are ultimately incurring some amount of risk.
Yep.
And it is better to do that in a more controlled way, especially whenever Legacy can kind of have a spot where it is harder to get into. So if somebody ends up exiting the format because we unban too many things at once, their deck becomes unplayable, and it takes us a long time to fix that. It's not a given they're going to come back, and I really want to make sure there is still a Legacy community to have a format for it.
All right. I do have a good question about Legacy. So it says, for Legacy, you mentioned archetypes like Control being pushed out of the format. How do you feel about fair non-blue decks seeing increasingly less play? Do they have the tools needed to combat the unfair decks?
Generally speaking, I'm a really big fan of those sorts of decks, fair and unfair. I know I played a lot of Elves whenever I was on the outside, and always loved just playing the Elvish Visionary, Wired Wood, Symbiote games were my favorite ones. But I am optimistic that as more slow blue decks are introduced into the format, that those decks are going to be able to shine a little bit better. Historically, you end up seeing things like Maverick, Death and Taxes preying on Delver whenever they become larger, more prevalent, etc. So I'm hoping that creating more space for those decks to exist is going to mean, or excuse me, decks like Delver to exist, or just fair blue in general, is also going to mean that the pre-war formal-wear decks of the world are going to have more matchups to shine in, which will then give more room for people to actually feel okay.
To be fair, stuff like Death and Taxes, as long as Bowmasters is around.
All right.
Oh, X1s are
you've been quiet and patient.
a tricky thing.
I mean, I love hearing it. And stuff. It's great. Yeah.
But
it's Pauper time.
Pauper time. Pauper time. All right.
Baby.
So we took a bunch of actions in Pauper. So let's start with the bans. So we banned 3 cards here: Basking Broodscale, Kuldotha Rebirth, and Deadly Dispute. So these are 3 very different cards, Gavin. What's going on here?
Yeah, well, first I'm going to tell some of the background to the story here. So, Basking Broodscale has showed up last year in Modern Horizons 3 and immediately put a new combo deck on people's radar. This deck uses Sadistic Glee, a card few people probably remembered before this, but it's a single...
Stronghold?
That's from, that block somewhere, Tempest block somewhere, Stronghold.
Nice.
It's a single mana enchantment that says whenever a creature dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. If we put a Basking Broodscale back up on the screen, when a creature dies, puts a counter on the Broodscale, which makes a token that can sacrifice for mana. You can sacrifice that for a mana, which puts a counter on the Broodscale, and so on. And
like an infinitely large threat.
Ending you up with an infinitely large Broodscale and infinite colorless mana. Pretty easy to convert that into a win. It's a Splinter Twin style situation where it can kill you super early, or the game goes on for a while, you keep some of the combo pieces in your hand, you can just kill them. And actually, as it turns out, Glee is actually not even that weak sometimes on your big creatures. You play a Writhing Chrysalis, you put Glee on it, suddenly you're attacking for a bunch of damage, so it even has some other play in that deck. So in the last BNR, we talked for a while and decided to not ban anything at that time, but we wanted to watch for a few more months and use that time to really focus, do play testing, look at the data that was coming in, chat a lot about what we wanted to do to kind of sculpt the format more than just one single card banning.
Sure.
There's a few things that have been on our radar for a while, and we thought this would be a good chance to tackle.
Talk about the tapped artifact lands in the article.
To make a good number of changes here. So after watching the Glee decks for a few more months, see how they played out, eventually their win rate was around 53.5% on Magic Online, while many other decks were still sideboarding for them, building to beat them. It really changed the scope of the format with cards like Snuff Out becoming more prominent to help fight the combo. And frankly, it just wasn't that fun to play against. It sucks to just die on turn 3 sometimes. And I heard many stories of people who are going to play at local events, hadn't played Pauper for a little while, and they're just dead. They're like, I guess I'm dead. Of course, that's not the only reason we would take action, but not being fun and the play pattern there not being enjoyable is a reason why. So we axed that. So that was I'd say the most obvious thing. The community's been mentioning it for a while. I made a video back in December talking about cards we might touch, and that was certainly one of them. But the other two are maybe a little less expected, and I'll kind of talk through them now. So Deadly Dispute over the past year has, especially over the past year, it's been around for a long time, a couple years, it and Ichor Wellspring has created this really strong card draw engine that's pushed out most other card draw engines.
Deadly Dispute just is the backbone of black.
Ichor Wellspring at cantrips, you dispute it away, you draw 2 cards off this, another one for the Wellspring, you're up 4 cards, and hey, look, you probably do some more Ichor Wellsprings and Deadly Disputes, and a lot of decks have been using 4 Dispute plus 4 other cards like Eviscerator's Insight or Reckoner's Bargain alongside Ichor Wellspring. And this core black draw engine has become incredibly, incredibly prominent. Mini top 8s will feature 6+ copies of,
of this package
for Wellspring next to each other, and even among different decks.
Then you add like 2 to 3 more copies of another analog.
It's really pushed out a lot of other things, like say blue controlling strategies, and in decks like Affinity, it's incredibly strong. And in our playtesting, we really found that there's a lot of these effects: 2 mana, sack something, draw 2 cards, plenty of those out there. But Dispute is just a cut above all of those.
Because of the treasure.
It gives you a mana back, so it kind of only costs 1 mana. Turns out 1 mana makes a big difference. It gives you an artifact back for Affinity. It fixes your colors. It does so many different things. It ramps you even, right? You play a 1-drop and then you dispute it away. You suddenly have an extra. You can play a
extra on the turn after. Yeah.
So we decided to take action against this to break up that engine a little bit. It is something that we may have to come back and revisit if this is still the dominant kind of play pattern in Pauper, if people are still playing 4 Insight, 4 Bargain, 4 Ichor Wellspring. But this is a pretty notable ding, and I think we especially think it's a ding to Affinity, where you can't stack artifact lands, where there's so many artifacts running around in that strategy. While we made our decision before the most recent Pauper-geddon happened as well, which is a huge tournament series that happens in Italy, that top 8 featured 7 decks with 4 Ichor Wellspring, 4 Deadly Dispute, out of, I think, 700 plus players. So once again, just everywhere in the format, and we wanted to break that up a little bit.
Yeah.
The last one I'm going to touch on here is Kuldotha Rebirth. So Kuldotha Rebirth has been a staple of Pauper for a long time.
It's like a smaller one. This will just change the way Burns play.
And the red decks have really risen in power as more stuff has gotten added to them. It's gotten a number of cards, Clockwork Percussionist, a Reckless Lackey, a Goblin Tomb Raider is a huge one. It's just like that, plus Great Furnace is a Goblin Guide on turn 1 in Pauper, which is without any drawback, which is pretty powerful.
Yep.
And we've noticed, when looking at the Magic Online win percentages, that the polarity of this deck is really high. Now, what do I mean by polarity?
This is interesting.
Well,
this statistic is interesting.
Game 1 win rate is incredible, and then people sideboard in a bunch of cards to try and defeat it. Its Game 1 win rate against most decks in the format that are popular was like 65 to 70%. It was outrageous. Yeah, Carmen is laughing.
No, that's one of those ones where it's just like, I think a lot of people in the outside go, oh, it's like a 70% matchup. And you kind of go, no,
it's not.
That's not.
Yeah.
Most decks are falling like the 50 to 60 range. Actual factual 70% win rate is so high.
It's
when you look
insane.
at the data, normally it's like, oh, okay, your decks fluctuate from like 46% to the high 50s sometimes. To see it having that high of a polarity
In game 1,
now,
so
it's interesting that the deck is not inherently, like it doesn't necessarily top 8 all the time in our tournaments, because
it doesn't necessarily do anything
8
broken
cards against it sometimes to help take it down a notch. But that kind of polarity is not the most fun, right? If you're like, my sideboard has to be 8 cards to fight this one deck, and that's what the whole matchup is determined by how many blue elemental blasts I drew. It becomes,
or like just if you place a well-placed Weather the Storm, that's all you need.
And it's the most played deck on Magic Online as well by a wide margin. So on average, you are queuing into playing these decks that are hyper fast, will beat you on turn 1.
That's due to a different reason as well.
So we thought it'd be a good idea to take that deck down a peg, so you can hopefully have to sideboard fewer cards against it, and it evens out a little bit. We'll see what happens. I know Kuldotha Rebirth is a card players have loved, been around for a long time. We looked a lot at 3 cards. It was Kuldotha Rebirth. It was Goblin Bushwhacker. It's kind of the combo there, right? Kuldotha Rebirth plus Bushwhacker is just 8 hasty damage from hand.
Yeah.
And Goblin Tomb Raider, which is a new addition and is that aforementioned Goblin Guide. We ultimately went with the Rebirth. I think Red will still be in pretty good shape. Like, there's a lot of strong tools in Pauper, but we're going to watch and see what happens. If it falls back behind and lags,
I'll address why. I think it's a good change.
Edge, maybe Rebirth comes back and we knock another card instead. We're not afraid to make these kind of dynamic changes in Pauper to help fine-tune the format. The other thing is, with so many things changing at once, right? Broodscale getting banned, and Dispute getting banned, and Rebirth getting banned, the format's going to be changed a lot.
Wild West, truly.
And so we're going to come back and reevaluate in a couple months at the next BNR on June 30th to maybe make a few updates there, depending on how the metagame shakes out.
Yeah. Speaking of a lot changing, there were unbans too.
Yes.
So we're not done with Pauper yet. Let's throw those unbanned.
Deadly Dispute banning is probably a lot bigger than these.
One of these, I'm like, yeah, okay, Prophetic Prism. That's it. It's a cute little thing. High Tide is a dangerous, dangerous card.
Well, context.
Let's start there, and then we'll go to Prophetic.
Yeah, it's pretty fun. I saw a Reddit comment yesterday I loved, which is, in Pauper, only in Pauper, you see 3 jank commons getting banned, and one of the most powerful combo enablers in history getting unbanned. Classic Pauper move. So first of all, I want to set the stage a little bit. So we've talked about High Tide a lot. I've had multiple videos talking about it. We've done our own investigations on it, and we've talked about it for a long time. We decided not to unban it previously, but it is a beloved card for Pauper players. Or beloved card by players. It's never really been legal in Pauper. It's kind of in this weird space where it was only legal in tabletop Pauper before the formats were unified, and then when we unified them, we banned it. So people never really got a chance to give it its fair try. People have asked for it for ages, right? Because it's such an iconic card and people love it from other formats. And while Broodscale wasn't the right combo deck to be around, many players have asked for spell-based combo to exist in the format, which a lot of Eternal formats, it's a hallmark of them. So we wanted to give something a try, and we wanted to do some unbannings here. And we were talking about it, and we've talked about High Tide and gone back and forth, and people have been split on it for a long time. And so eventually, it kind of came to me in the shower one day. I had this idea of, what if we tried something called a trial unban? So this is something new that Pauper is doing here. I wouldn't expect any other format to do it, but because of the accessibility of Pauper, and we're pretty keen on making these dynamic changes, we want to give it a try. So what a trial unban is we'll unban a card, and then we'll come back at the next BNR and decide if it's going to stay banned or reban it. And I set some pretty clear criteria in the article of what we're looking for in particular when it comes to High Tide. High Tide is a strong combo card. No surprise if it ends up being good.
The enablers don't exist for it.
If it ends up being one of the top 3 decks in the metagame, we will probably ban it again. If it doesn't get played at all, well, then we'll probably leave it unbanned. Seems fine. And if it's kind of somewhere in the middle as a fringe deck or a little better than a fringe deck, that's great with us. We like these kind of spell combo decks if they are around and something you can think about, but not if they're like the best thing you can do in the format. So we're going to be keeping a close eye on it. I know I watched a couple streams yesterday of people playing it, and opinions ranged wildly on how strong the deck was. I saw it kill somebody on like turn 3 or 4, one game, and then in the first game, then die the next 2 games in the match, right? So I mean, all things are possible. We will see what happens with this, and I think a lot of folks are going to find the right way to take it. There's some ghostly flicker shenanigans happening with High Tide. That's nice. So you ghostly flicker your island, of course, once you've cast 2 High Tides naturally to generate mana with Archaeomancer, which is kind of what we thought people would do. Familiars have started using it. So we'll learn a lot as things go along. The last thing I'll say on High Tide, I mentioned this in the article as well. If we are really off on this, and the format is totally dominated by High Tide, if it is like the only deck people are playing, if there are no countermeasures, we may come back sooner than the next BNR. That would be very unlikely that would happen, but if all you're seeing is 8 High Tide decks in the top 8, we're about to enter an important season for Magic the Gathering Online with Pauper. We don't want to make that the only thing people can play. So if we have to, we'll come back. Unlikely though, unlikely.
Well, and I think one of the things you mentioned that struck me too is a lot of the traditional High Tide enablers are already banned in Pauper.
Cloud of Fairies and
reduces some of the risk there.
Peregrine
Totally.
Drake.
When I was talking about these bans in the BNR meeting and with other designers, they're like, "Wow, isn't that wild?" With Cloud of Fairies, yeah, that's banned. Okay, what about Frantic Search? Yeah, that's banned. What about Peregrine Drake? Yeah, that's banned. So I mean, you got Snap, you got Snap, but a lot of that stuff is off the table already in Pauper. There, Spellstutter Sprite is highly played. Duress is a card you've seen a lot of sideboards. So there are a lot of ways to interact with it. But I do think, I would encourage all of you out there, it'll take probably a couple weeks for Pauper to settle. These are some big changes. And so I wouldn't take anything you see in the first 24, 48, 72 hours to be indicative of how this is going to play out. So we'll see what happens as the format evolves.
All right. Okay, so those are all the formats that we took action in.
What about
Prophetic Prism?
Oh yeah, Prophetic Prism.
Prophetic Prism?
No,
as an OG Affinity player, you gotta put respect on Prism.
I know, it's just like Prophetic Prism.
All the credit here.
Hold on, Tron players, come on.
Yeah. Anyway, Prophetic Prism.
Put some respect on Prism's name. I was there for that ban.
Card we've talked about for a long time. We banned it at a time where the format looked a lot different, where Tron was ruling the roost, and now we would love Tron to be stronger. So we've seen the Energy Refractor, which is very close to this card, show up and do well. So we thought we could take it off and try it. With that said, our biggest concern is that it would buff Affinity too much. We were taking away Deadly Dispute, which fixed its mana, and now we're giving it back this card, which will fix its mana again. So we'll have to see how that does. It's possible it could end up rebanned, but we'll see how that turns out. High Tide, definitely the more talked about one of these two, but Prism has a pedigree in Pauper.
Something to do with Archaeomancer.
And then, if these go well, you might see some more trial unbans in the future. We talked about a few other cards, so we'll see what happens.
All right. Now moving on.
Okay, there we go.
There we go. So we are going to talk about the formats where we didn't take action, but even before we get to those, there have been a lot of comments in chat, in the social media sphere about timing. And you know,
okay, I'm happy. I was just about to pause it, but
to scheduled announcements, what we think
I'm
of
happy they're addressing this.
standard announcements. I think we'll talk about that in context of standard, but and why we don't go back to ban whenever we feel like it, sort of thing. So why don't you all? I have thoughts too, but I want to hear from you two. I'm just the host. Yeah.
Okay, great. So something that we really value is making sure that Magic is for as many people as possible. I think that there are a lot of us who would love if Magic changed more often than it did. We play a lot of Magic. We spend all day thinking about Magic. I joke all the time about the number of deck lists I've scrawled in notebooks in my life. I'm sure we've all been there at some point. I know you. I think you even still have a couple of yours from when you were a kid.
I got some good classics in my closet.
Yeah. But not everyone engages the Magic that way. And it's really important that Magic is for as many people as possible, and the stability that is provided by our current ban cadence is something that I believe we feel pretty good about. We've seen play rate rise over time in part as a result of that, we think. I'll let you talk on that a little bit more, but for the most part, we've generally found it to be better for tournament attendance and player engagement, for people to know that whenever they go out and collect the cards for a deck, they know that they will be able to play with that deck for at least an amount of time.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the things is, and you know, people start playing Magic at all different points. So you know, I'm not going to assume that people who are raising this played during the time, but we did this. We did this for a couple years where we just kind of banned thing. We took the schedule off and we'll give you like a week's notice and then we'll ban things.
Yeah.
It wasn't good.
No, it really wasn't.
We moved away from it for various reasons. Among them,
that's what people forget.
People getting ready for major tournaments. Hey, is there going to be a ban announcement? Hey, are you going to ban something? Like, we got to get ready for this. You know, and we'd have to make announcements. It seemed like every other week.
I personally had to write an article once about how panic-stricken I was having to source an entire new deck in like 2 days because we reversed a ban announcement 3 days after making it. And that is really tough.
Yeah.
It is, and it was chaos for players. It was chaos for us internally, and I don't think, you know, I'll criticize us a bit. I think our decisions were a bit off at that time because there wasn't this sort of, okay, we're going to have these results to look at. We're going to do it this date. It was sort of this rolling thing where it's just sort of people
you weren't
looked around
set on the sample size that you could use to make that decision.
Is there a problem right now? The other part of that is formats don't always line up. We're going to talk about that a little bit with
that's probably the biggest criticism with
announcement. But
bans.
If we needed to make a change in, let's say Modern, let's say we needed to, you know, change Underworld Breach, the timing for another format may not quite line up because they haven't had their major event yet. Yeah. Do we wait and try to do it all at the same time? Do we do one and then do the next format in a couple weeks? You know, people complain about spoiler fatigue. We were going through BNR fatigue, where it was every week there was a conversation about, does this need to be banned? Does this need to be banned? But I think what you said is an even bigger point, which is there are a lot of players, I'll even dare call it a majority, who value consistency and being able to go to their store once a week, twice a month, whatever their cadence is, and bring their deck and not have to constantly check, is it still legal? Is it still legal? Has the format changed? Can I still play this? That sort of thing.
And a lot of people don't even check before they go in. They just go, I've had to be the person working at the LGS before they went, hey, do you want to have a conversation away from the table for a second? Do you want to replace your birthing pods with forests? And that sucks. So, you know, we value it because it's clear communication. We value it because it provides consistency for players. And we value it because it lets everybody know exactly what's going to happen when. Now, the other part of this is we made a shift in, so we did timing
tied to set releases for a bit.
Right.
And that was with messing with play seasons. So last year we made the change to time these more to play seasons, which again, dropping something in the middle of an RCQ season, super disruptive.
Absolute
Players want to know that they can
absolute
pick their deck for an
competitive
RCQ season, play it at the events they want to play it during that season, and be fine and not have to constantly shift that.
I think mastery of something, a deck in particular, is something a lot of players resonate with and want to feel like, okay, if I get
especially
whatever deck
in
it is
older
for
formats.
week 1 of this RCQ season, be it, I'll just throw out energy, for example, and I learn the ins and outs of it, and I learn which decks I'm supposed to be on the Mardu version of energy, or the Jeskai version, or just straight Boros. That's something that a lot of players want to feel like their decisions matter. Them investing a ton of effort into learning everything about this deck is going to be rewarded.
Yeah. And so I think, I don't know, I think a lot of comments about the cadence are, I'm going to generalize here, but I think it's true, are from the most engaged.
Sure.
And we need to be able to serve both the most engaged and the
vocal minority,
the lightly engaged, the whole spectrum of where people play. So that's our reasoning. And sometimes it results in tough formats for a little bit. We've seen that. But it also results in people being able to play their decks. So that's our thought process, I think. Agree with it, disagree with it, but that's where we're at.
I share my sense of.
Now let's move on to standard, which has been a lot of the conversation around.
Let's just they're moving into formats that I'm not really that big on. So let's hop into this. So I should add like a transition screen, but regardless, I got a little blur going in the background. Regardless, so let's address the rotation. Then I want to address the 3 formats that I play constructed wise, which is why I'm ignoring kind of the rest of it. So firstly, addressing the rotation side of things. So when it comes to working with both the casual audience and the vocal minority as well, right? You have to remember the vast majority of Magic players are casual. And so that's why you come up in this scenario where they were just talking about where there's a situation in the LGS and someone doesn't have the updated ban list. They weren't aware of the changes that were being made. And so what I find is a lot of times when you go on like Magic Twitter, for example, for the good or the bad, it tends to be the Andrea Mengucci's of the world talking about, we need to end schedule BNRs, or it's the grinders talking about we need to end schedule BNRs. And I think there really needs to be a balance between this, because we see this in so many other games where you can't always make changes for the competitive environment or the top echelon of players. You can work with them, and you definitely can, but you can't always make those changes because those players are not aware of the goings on at the lower ranks or kind of the larger population at the lower level. So Magic the Gathering doesn't necessarily have like an elo system. So in some ways, I'm already mentally comparing this to maybe the grind of something like Overwatch or Marvel Rivals, where you have balancing at the top level and then also balancing that also matters at the lower level. And so you have to design cards, design characters that are appealing, but also have mass appeal and mechanical ability that works throughout the whole spectrum. Now, that's very hard to do when it comes to cards. And so you ultimately have this disconnect where at the tournament level, I mean, I've talked about this with the modern format plenty of times, like the tier 2, tier 3 of modern tends to actually be pretty diverse. Once you get into the competitive metagame of the world in top level tournaments, then it tends to be a bit more homogenized. And when it comes to at least like LGS level Magic, things tend to be actually pretty varied. A lot of times people don't have the infinite funds to invest in different strategies. They will be the Death Shadow player or just the Grixis mana based player for a while. They will be the Mill player for the while. They will be the Titan player for a while. And so when it comes to like strategies like that, you see that diversity at the local level, at the casual level, at the league level. But again, once you get to challenges, once you get to NRG series and stuff like that, you see Mox, Opal, Underworld grinding Breach decks everywhere. And so I think you strike that balance, you let the casuals see what's going on and justify that change, or the casuals get disenfranchised with what's going on. They feel disconnected and they feel like uninformed as to what's going on because they're just not playing enough games. And these are the people that we also need to cater to, because at the end of the day, the vast majority of players are not only casuals, but they're also commander players. And so when you have these different connecting views and trying to get people into constructed, you have to realize the cadence at which these players are working with. And if you want them to play constructed, you have to make that more accessible. And so having this wide sample size, having these set seasons, there's a logic to it. And I think it's fair. I think the criticism is there. Maybe we could increase the frequency of it or whatever, but they just talked about some of the logistical nightmares of managing so many things in the background as well while all of this is going on. So I think that's my first initial take there. I'd love to hear some counterpoints down below as to what y'all are thinking. Like, maybe is there something a part of this picture that I'm missing? Let me know in the comment section down below. But let's hop right into modern. Okay. So when it comes to modern, I feel like not enough has changed. Underworld Breach was addressed. I feel like we could have had an unbanning. There are plenty of cards that I feel like could have been unbanned, and there is warrant for it because I feel like nothing really changed in the format. But also, do some of those cards really add anything to the format? Now, Glimpse of Nature was something I was specifically brought up. A card that sees play in Legacy Elves. If Elves is even viable, and it's not right now. Maybe it could be after these bans. That's, we'll address that in a second. But as long as Orcish Bowmasters is around, I guess not. But again, that's a card, Glimpse of Nature. You draw a card every time you cast a creature spell. You draw a card, and you're doing that in a green-based strategy that's likely lower to the ground, lower cost. You're probably playing Elves. A lot of them are X1s, Bowmasters hits, and then you have the draw of Glimpse, which Bowmasters hits. And so there's a lot of these cards that I think already get countered by current status quo level cards in the format that we can unban. And Gavin's already talking about trial unbans, and that's specifically for the Pauper format, but maybe something like that in modern. And now they also talked about how they don't necessarily want to unban cards that like don't really see that level of impact or just leave a bad taste in people's mouth and just don't really have the intended change. For example, Splinter Twin was like a community asked unbanned, but to be fair, it almost did nothing, right? Like, surprisingly, the other three had such larger impacts on the format than Splinter Twin ever did. Splinter Twin's like a dead card. It really is just at the bottom of the barrel right now in terms of modern play, viability in the format. And so if you brought back Glimpse of Nature, it almost feels like that is what would happen with that card. So do they want to do that with another card? I think that's a fair argument for it as well, but that doesn't mean we need to keep increasing the ever-growing modern ban list. There are cards that never should come off, Oko, Arkham's Astrolabe, Grief, stuff like that, Simian Spirit Guide. It doesn't mean that we can't unban other things that potentially have now been power crept out of the format. But when it comes to Legacy, now, I'm really interested to hear Thraben Yu, Bosch and Roll, and the Eternal Glory podcast in general on their takes on this. But generally what's going on is, as they mentioned, and I talked about this in yesterday's video, but Sowing Mycospawn held back the blue decks because you got rid of their basics, and you got rid of their basics that not only cast Brainstorm Ponder like the island, but you also got rid of their basic that casted removal, whether that be black or more prominently white. And then you grab the Wasteland off the initial search trigger to get rid of their non-basic, which had to help them flex into that color or into a third color. So all of these options are now all gone, and you've created this mana delta that's massive. Not only a turn delta because you're able to ramp out so far with the fast mana that they were talking about, but now this mana delta has just been like extremely pushed to the point where you can't even make your way back with the resources you have because you've gotten rid of two of their lands, and mana wise you're functioning at like turn 56 or something. So that's the first thing. The blue decks are gone. Their idea is that a lot of people talk about how Oops wasn't touched. Now Oops is pretty consistently winning on turn one. As someone who's tried out Oops for a couple leagues, it's a hilariously busted deck. The thing is it actually does fairly well get stopped by the blue decks. And so I struggled in a lot of situations against decks like Stifle Knot, where I didn't have the turn one win. And, in game one, I'd probably get there. But in game 2 and 3, honestly, they had a fair amount of options that would be able to stop that, especially uniquely Stifle Knot being able to stifle some certain abilities. So, of course, they had that added bit. But the blue-based strategies always felt like they had those options against me. And so if those are stronger, it almost feels like Oops gets answered in that way. So maybe, it's not just Dimir Reanimator and a mid-range control deck with a combo win condition that doesn't want to grind. But now maybe the blue-based Delver deck that wants to grind sees its way back. And now some of these other decks that prey on those decks can potentially have their way into the metagame as well. So I like that aspect. I think with these two changes, it's a good step forward. And I think looking at something something like Oops down the line is very possible. And if we do that, then we could possibly look at some unbans as well. I think there are some very interesting unbans that could happen. But again, this is coming from someone that's only gotten into Legacy really well in the last like 6 months. I have a very face value representation of the format. I am primarily a painter player, so I am playing that busted mid-range deck with an I win button, which can definitely see a lot of downticks based on how the metagame changes, but I'm still excited to see where the Legacy metagame goes based on some of this. Now, the Troll of Khazad-dûm change, I'm maybe not too aware of. I think there's a lot of proponents, a lot of people talking about the reanimate ban, but I think some of the things that they were talking about in terms of what Troll of Khazad-dûm does is important. And, you know, again, I don't have too much of an opinion of that. I have a lot more opinions on the broken stuff because I've had a chance to play all of that. And I think there is an opportunity for those decks to now have this gap to be addressed with Sowing Mycospawn and potentially some other portions of what Eldrazi can do now being significantly brought down. Now, last thing with Pauper. Now, with the Pauper format, oh, Lord, I don't see what High Tide is going to do. It's something to do with Archaeomancer. I have not played Pauper specifically for, you know, just because I want to do my research going into it. If High Tide is going to be unbanned, that means a lot of blue decks are going to be running around, which means my favorite deck, One Land Spy, is going to have a very difficult time. So I am very reserved in seeing what is going to be good, but obviously I'm still going to hop in. I'm probably going to be playing some Affinity. Let me know in the comment section down below if you want to see that gameplay later in the week, but I definitely want to try out some Affinity in the format right now. But I'm very curious to see what actually lands up at the top. A lot of people playing High Tide, but is it even that good? Pyroblast would be very good against that. They'd probably, you know, Dispel again, like Archaeomancer is probably key to the loop of bringing back High Tide or something. Like, I just don't understand what the win condition is. If it's like blue-based control, just looking for more mana, I don't know. But something like that, I'm really interested to see. Prophetic Prism, I definitely want to try at Affinity, and we'll probably see some amount of like Tron make its way back as well. So I'm really interested to see where all of that goes. But I mean, I don't think Burn is going to be going anywhere because, as I was mentioning, with Kuldotha Rebirth gone, you will see the Bushwhacker package go, and you'll probably see like the Firebrand Archer style of deck where like you cast a spell and you're somehow, whether through tapping your creature and untapping it or just casting a spell, you're able to deal damage to your opponent. Like that version of spell-based burn is probably going to make its way back. Still very answerable through sideboard pieces. And a lot of people were talking about how, oh yeah, you know, Weather the Storm and stuff like that. Post board, that game one win rate really, you know, plummets, and it's not like you're seeing it at a high level. But it's very important to remove some of those polarizing options and not feel like your sideboard has to be fully dedicated to something like that. And especially if something like Snuff Out was seeing all that play to answer the Glee decks, it just naturally opened up a little bit more room for burn as well, because Snuff Out just naturally make it so on average against those type of decks playing Snuff Out, they just had less life to work with. And so that was just like a free lightning bolt and some for those burn decks. So I think a lot of that is important. And whether or not they cast those Snuff Outs, it doesn't matter. It just ends up being a dead card in their hand. So that in itself is a resource gain with that. So in general, I'm excited to see, you know, even with Affinity taking a bit of a notch, I think Prophetic Prism could help a little bit. I'm really hesitant to see where High Tide goes. I think, you know, whatever, there are smarter Pauper minds out there, you know, kind of working on that. I still have yet to go on our Pauper to see what's going on with that card. I'm just hypothesizing it's probably something to do with Archaeomancer and some amount of blinking and some type of blue X combo control type of strategy. I'm just curious to see what the combo finish is, again, without without Peregrine Drake or Cloud of Fairies or the other one, the one that's like an instant, you draw cards, you do untap. Without those options available in the format, how are we really comboing off with something like that, or creating quote unquote infinite mana? Maybe it's just with value. But I'm excited to see this type of change in Pauper. I think we really do need to take a look at the tapped artifact lands, but maybe if Affinity is held back enough, we don't really need to take that change. But I'm again curious with when it comes to Modern. I think more changes need to have happened. Something needs to come out of Energy, in my opinion. Maybe Eldrazi, but I think like we could have had some more unbans with the Pauper format. Just honestly, cautious optimism. Really excited to see where the format is going. With Legacy, I have a face value opinion, but honestly, I'm just excited. It's a format that I'm still getting into, but I'm curious to see what more informed creators have in terms of their takes on the format. So I definitely will be got the notification bell push for both of those. So excited to see what happens with those. And again, just overall really excited to see where Constructed Magic is going. I'm curious what some of y'all thoughts are with, you know, no changes in Standard, no changes in Pioneer, notably. It's like Pioneer's found dead out in a ditch. Like ain't nobody care. No RCQ season, no RC whatever. And I guess I was talking to a friend of mine, Jack, and he was talking about how, you know, I think they didn't want any Pioneer changes because they're tired of people complaining about, they're tired of people complaining about, is it Phoenix? But whatever. Who knows? Who knows? Regardless, I'll be a Pioneer hater till the day I die, I guess. Regardless, let me know what y'all think about the constructed bans. Let me know what you think is missing. Let me know if you think one of my takes are off at all. I'm not going to pretend like I'm the most informed player in the world. I do like to just be a little clear in terms of where I'm coming from for my resources. But regardless, you know, enjoy the bans, I guess. Enjoy the new formats.